Hey folks, welcome back to the channel. This is day 2 of creating a piece of Black Panther movie poster artwork, specifically this image featuring my wonderful friend Converse Ninja, who is a great cosplayer and a wonderful human being. This is a 3-day event on the channel. If you missed day 1 and the reasons why, ultimately this is in response to the untimely death of Chadwick Boseman, who played Black Panther in the Marvel films, as well as many other brilliant performances that were incredibly impactful, incredibly talented. He was a wonderful human being that was very inspirational. He passed away on August 28th, 2020 of stage 4 colon cancer. He was 43 years old. So in times of crisis and difficulty, I often turn to creativity and Photoshop to be able to find some clarity and a little bit of peace to find my way forward. And I wanted to essentially offer that option to folks who are dealing with this or just simply looking to learn a little bit about composite artwork in Photoshop and have an interest in cosplay. So day 1, we covered the photography on set with Converse Ninja and how I captured the images. We talked a little bit about my inspirations from the film and how it was impactful to me as well as his, and how that works together with photographer and cosplayer to create some truly interesting artwork and experiences both for your art and for your business. And then how we took the images into Adobe Camera Raw and processed them. Today, we're going to be taking the image through dodging and burning using the quick selection tool and extraction and layer masks. There's been an update. I spoke with Converse Ninja. He gave his blessing and permission to have these images given to all of you. So if you look in the description below, you will find a link to the Google Drive where you can download the JPEG files, a few of them from the session, so that you can create your own artwork around this wonderful, amazing character and the actor who portrayed him, or you can follow along and create this exact piece if you can find some stock that matches it as we go forward. So again, look to the description below. You'll find that link for those images. I do want to give a brief disclaimer and say that I do not own the copyright or trademark of Black Panther. These are my images that I'm providing to you for educational purposes only. Whatever you do with the artwork once you have completed it, it's on you, especially for the legality issues, so please be careful with all of that. So let's continue forward with day 2 of making this piece of composite artwork featuring Black Panther, Converse Ninja, and celebrating the life of Chadwick Boseman. Hi folks, welcome back. In the previous video, we took the image through Adobe Camera Raw and processed it to take it into Photoshop. And now in this video, we're going to do some dodging and burning to enhance the costume and give it a sense of three-dimensionality. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and run the dodge and burn action, which is going to populate the curves adjustment layers that I need to do dodging and burning. And if you haven't seen that beginner video that shows you how to make the action for dodging and burning, go ahead and take a break, check that video out. It's very short and we'll show you how to create that action itself. So as always, I like to start with the burn layer and create some shadows. What I want to do is hit B for brush. I'm going to be painting with an opacity of 100%. I'm going to change my flow to be 10% by hitting Shift and the number 1 to take it up to 10%. And then this is a hide all mask or a black mask. I need to paint with white as my foreground color on that mask to begin to reveal the effect of the curve adjustment layer. So I'm going to go ahead and hit the letter X to switch to white. Now what I want to do, because the black and white adjustment layer, it just enables me to see the image in its purest form of luminosity values of white, black, and gray. In this case, since we can't see his face, it doesn't necessarily have the same impact as it would if you're dodging and burning a subject where you can see their face, but we can still get some of those same effects. So my goal first, when I create those shadows, is to just ultimately look at the existing darker portions of the image and start enhancing those with this burn curve adjustment layer. However, I also want to think about it from a perspective of giving the image three-dimensionality and giving it structure in that regard. So I'm going to go ahead and start painting just along the perimeter edges of his eyes through here, and just again trying to augment a sense of the existing shadows that are already there and give it a sense of three-dimensionality at the same time. I'm looking for specific areas in the structure of the mask and the costume that I can augment by adding some more shadow to it, and again, of course, driving some focus to certain key aspects of the mask and making all of that believable. Under the shadow, under the jaw, I want to enhance the natural shadow that's there because again, I chose to use that butterfly lighting pattern to augment and give some shadows into the image. Here in the neck piece, I can augment the shadows that are built into it and then come back and give it a little bit of a touch with a highlight, and that highlight touch will then complete the overall effect that you see and will enhance and give it that sense of three-dimensionality. As I work, my left hand is on the right and left bracket keys, which will increase my brush size and make it bigger or smaller as I go, so I don't have to take time away to come up to the brush palette and change my size of my brush. I can just simply hit those bracket keys and make things bigger or smaller. And then because I'm using my Wacom Intuos Pro tablet and pen, I have bound the button on the pen that is closest to my index finger. I have bound that to the letter X, which will flip back and forth between white and black as my foreground and background colors, and just save me a little bit more time as I'm working. Again, for the burns, I'm looking for crevices where the hands meet, where there will be a natural shadow, where the arms are crossing through this area here, so I can enhance those shadows as well. And then just any area of a little bit more darker value that I see in the image that I can augment. And of course, any unique ripple or texture in the image, the costume, that I can enhance and augment. So at this point, I think the shadows look pretty good. So I'm going to go ahead and go to now the dodge and start adding some of that brightness to the image itself. I'm going to first and foremost look at the hot spots in the image and just augment those a little bit more. I can augment the hot spots where the light is hitting it, which will help sculpt it, but it also will help call out some of that detail that we see in the image and give it in the costume. And it will give it a little bit more of a punch. All of these wonderful silver painted lines that we see into the structure, if we just paint those a little bit with some dodge, they will just enhance and stand out a little bit further. I'm hitting the eyes because I do plan on adding a glow to the eyes once we get into Photoshop and the world building. Now we're back down into the neck piece of the costume. So I'm going to go ahead and just augment some of those and enhance them just a little bit more. These areas through here, the silver part of the neck piece. And I'm being pretty general with my brush strokes because again, I'm working on a costume where I can't see his face and most of his body is covered up with the costume. So these are more general painting strokes that I'm making. I don't have to be incredibly accurate. If this is a beauty retouch for, male or female, doesn't matter, then ultimately I would be a little bit more structured and careful. Let's talk about what I just did here. I just went like this and made a bright dodge, but looking at it, I'm like, I don't think we really need to call that much attention to his tummy. So I'm going to go ahead and use my pen. I'm hitting the button to switch my foreground color back to black to then undo what I did, because again, we're working on a layer mask where all I have to do is paint white or black. White will reveal the effect, black will take it away. So if I go too far or go outside the lines or anything along those parameters, I can just paint black and undo what I did on that layer mask. That's why I've said in videos in this series, and I say when I teach, that layer masks and layer blending modes are the two most powerful aspects of Photoshop, in my opinion. Okay, I think I'm going to go ahead and hit Command or Control minus to zoom back out a few steps. And then I'm going to turn off the black and white adjustment layer. So now with these curves adjustment layers grouped together, all I have to do is turn off the group to see the original image before the dodge and burn, and then afterwards, so I can start assessing, have I went too far in certain areas? So I'm going to turn off the group and then turn it back on and bounce this way a couple of times. I'm looking at the body and the suit. The dodge and the shadows really give it a sense of three-dimensionality. I think it looks fantastic. I'm now looking at the face. The face is really jumping out in that three-dimensional pattern, which I'm really liking. And I don't think we went too far in really any major areas. And dodging and burning, especially when it comes to cosplay or fantasy work and composites, dodging and burning is such an integral step because it can give the image a sense of three-dimensionality for sure, but it makes it feel illustrated. It gives it an artistic quality that feels like some artistic enhancement to the image. And really all you're doing is using luminosity, highlight and shadow to your advantage to sculpt and create a beautiful aspect to the image. So at this point, I think it looks good the way it is. You know, I might actually go ahead and take the overall opacity of the dodge layer down just a little bit, because I think it might be just a little too strong across the board. Let's take it to 74%. That's fine. I just want to give it a little less punch, so those shadows are a little bit more strong, because I know that with the artistic process that we're going to do with all the stock, we're going to be using some colors and luminosity values there that are in the stock itself to infuse into the picture of Black Panther. So ultimately, I don't need the highlights to be too strong. I can just take them down just a little bit. So at this point, I think this looks good. We can go ahead now. So from the previous video, we have the layers of dodging and burning that you can see here in the layers window itself. I'm going to go ahead and flatten this, which means I'm working destructively. So as I continue to go forward, I will not be able to go back and undo some of these dodges and burns that I have done. So I need to make sure that I'm good with what I see, which I am, and then we can move forward now. So I'm going to go ahead and come up to layer, and then flatten image. You can also see that I have bound the F4 key to flatten image because I flatten quite a bit. So I'm going to go ahead and flatten the entire process. Now it's down into one image, the background layer itself. And then I'm going to hit W for the quick selection tool. Now, again, in previous videos, I've talked about how to use the quick selection tool to make sure that you can get an accurate representation and selection of your image before you go into the select and mask dialog. However, when you hit W for quick selection, one of the options that you can see at the top is select subject. And this is essentially Photoshop's algorithm Skynet version looking for John Connor in your photo and trying to make a selection itself. Now, I'm going to go ahead and do select subject. I don't recommend using it because the more that you use the actual quick selection tool, engaging with the image, the more the algorithm is learning what kind of pixels you're looking for and the information that you're looking for. But for giggles, since this costume is so predominantly black and it's against a gray seamless piece of paper, I'm curious to see what it will actually pick up. So I'm going to hit W to make sure that we're again on the tool, and then I'm going to hit select subject, and it will think for a moment. And then it should make a pretty... Skynet is real. Skynet's coming for it. Skynet, there's Terminators at the door. I'm looking for John Connor. I do a really good Arnold Schwarzenegger impression. I do an impression of Arnold Schwarzenegger to the point that it actually turned into Christopher Walken doing Arnold Schwarzenegger, and that's for a different time. So anyway, let's zoom in and see how good this selection is. It's really good. There's just some fine little elements that it missed. And those things can certainly, we can use the quick selection tool to overcome some of those issues. So for instance, this little section right here that the costume is missing, that's certainly something very easy to clean up with the layer mask itself. But again, my philosophy is to try to get as accurate a representation or a selection as possible before we go into select a mask. So I'm going to go ahead and hit W to make sure I'm again on the quick selection tool, using my left and right bracket keys to make the brush bigger or smaller. And then I'm just going to tap, and I'm in additive mode and I'm tracing. And because I'm in additive mode, it's adding to the overall selection. And what I love is that it didn't do a rough jump around the entire image trying to find a bunch of different stuff. So let's see how far we can push it. We're going to go along the perimeter. I'm not worried about those little bits of fringe down there. Okay, and then over here, coming up, there's just a little bit right there that we might want to go ahead and grab. I can see as we zoom in, here is a section of pixels that select subject did not grab. So this is inside the selection, and I will definitely want that in the image. And this is why if you choose to use select subject, it's vital that you go through the selection before you go into select and mask, which is this button here, select and mask when you're on the quick selection tool. It's vital that you go through and police the image, because if you don't, and you don't look at everything in select and mask, this little part will get taken out as we run through select and mask and the different controls inside of that. So I want to make sure that there's just no missing little pieces like that inside of the perimeter of our selection. Okay, there's a little bit of the background that we don't want, so I want to go into reductive mode to take away from the selection. I'm in additive mode right now because the brush circle has a plus sign in it. If I hold Alt Option, that will defer to reductive mode so that I can make a little gesture like this and get rid of some of all of that. And then I don't have to actually come up and hit reductive mode on the tool set. Here's another little piece that's missing. And again, this is why I'm not a fan of selective subjects, because it did a good job, but I do believe with a couple of brush strokes with the quick selection tool, it would have found everything that we need, because this image is a little bit of a cheat because ultimately it is predominantly black. So it is one color against the gray background, and it does a good job of making those selections when you're not fighting against multiple different colors or textures with the item that you're trying to select. I was curious to see how it would work because since the costume has silver elements in it and the black elements are close to gray, they're not a pure black, I was curious how that would go. So I'm going to go ahead and just complete the subject. And as you can see, like the selection is trying to reach out further to find something and then add it to the selection. But then after the algorithm, when I release my pen, when I let go, the algorithm thinks and it looks across the entire image, trying to find things that are similar. And then it will reevaluate and reassess that new line. So don't be afraid when it starts to jump out, because it's really just looking around the entire image, but it should bounce back to a relative approximation of the actual selection you want, instead of just jumping out at random to these odd tangents of stuff. Okay, I think I'm gonna hit Control or Command 0 to zoom all the way back out. I think it's a pretty good selection. Skynet did a really good job. So I'm going to go ahead and now hit Select and Mask, which will take us into a new dialog. And this is where we will get access to different tools and controls that we can use to refine the selection a little bit further before we output it to a new layer with a layer mask. So I'm going to first and foremost make sure that I'm in overlay mode here so that I can see it. I've chosen the color blue. So we can see that anything that was missing, but in this case I don't think we have to worry about that, because again we policed the selection before we went through all of it. And then we can of course change the opacity of overlay mode if needs be. The most powerful part of the Select and Mask dialog is edge detection, where we've set a radius of 8 pixels and smart radius, so that ultimately the algorithm is now further refining the selection very minimally, coming in and out, looking along the perimeter for pieces that could be missing. So as we can see, because we've chosen the overlay view mode with the color blue, this part of the costume right through here has a lot of blue in it, which means ultimately that part is missing. And when we take it into the layer mask, that's going to be something that we have to clean up. But I don't want to take the time here and select a mask to try to get this little tiny little piece, because the more that I use tools like the Refine Edge Brush tool, which is this tool, the more that we use things like that, it's refining the entire perimeters selection. And that means that it potentially is introducing new problems as we go. And I don't want to take that risk over something as small as this little section of the costume that will be a very easy brush stroke to bring back in on the layer mask. I'm going to go ahead and again, the rest of the controls here under global refinements: smooth, feather, contrast, and shift edge. Smooth is set to 5, feather is at 0. I never use feather when I'm doing quick selection. Contrast is set to 8%, which is just going to clean up the edge and shore it up a little bit more. And then shift edge, it's a -3% that will come in and shift in the selection just a little bit, so that we aren't really grabbing too much of the background itself. And again, for an image like this of Black Panther, where the costume and everything is pretty enclosing, and there aren't a lot of fringe elements on the outside of it, and then again he's wearing a mask, so we can't see his face, we can't see his hair. If you have a little bit of gray or a color contamination from the background that comes onto the image, that's okay, because we can use different methods to clean that up very quickly. And ultimately, again, it is faster to do problem solving inside of Photoshop than using the algorithm to sit there and refine the edge over and over again. Skynet is wonderful, but it's just not up to par with what our human minds can do. So lastly, on this side, output settings, decontaminate colors, we're not going to check because we don't need it to, and I never use that, by the way. And then our output is to new layer with layer mask. So I'm going to go ahead and click that, which will take us back into Photoshop with this new layer. And then of course it's turned off our background layer so that we can see the transparency. And there's a lot of little edges to clean up and shore up to make a really good, perfect selection. So what I want to do is turn on my background layer, and then I'm going to go ahead and make a new blank layer in between. This is going to be a helper layer, just like we had in Select and Mask with the overlay mode. I want to fill this new layer with a color. Let's go ahead and choose this bright blue. And to fill this blank layer with it, I'm going to hit Alt or Option and hit Backspace, and that will then fill the entire layer with that color. And I'm actually going to leave it at 100%, the layer itself. Typically, I would take this layer's opacity in the layer window from 100% to 50%. But because I would do that so that, again, like in selected mask, if there was anything that was missing, it would enable me to be able to see it very quickly. But in this case, I'm going to leave it at 100% because all we really need to do is to shore up the edge using a very easy technique. And so I want to be able to see, because in this 100% view, I'm able to see edges like this, where the blue shining through indicates to me that that edge is missing. So I think we'll have a better view of when we're adding back to the selection here in just a moment if we leave that layer at 100% opacity. So I'm going to hit B for brush, and I'm going to go ahead and change my flow of my brush to 100% by hitting Shift and 0. And now I will be painting at a flow of 100% and opacity of 100%. But what I want to do is, traditionally, I would use my brush in normal mode first, going around the entire perimeter of this layer mask, cleaning it up. But I want to use a technique that is very simple to do, but you can't do it too much. You can't go too far with it, because as we do this, it's going to start making the edge very pixelated if we go too far. But what I want to do is change the blending mode of my brush from normal to overlay, and then hit enter on a PC to accept that window change. The reason why I want to do this is because now the entire perimeter will be protected. So if I paint white or black and I go outside the line, outside the selection, it isn't going to start bringing in just a bunch of stuff from the background because it's in overlay mode. It's just going to try to shore up the edge. Now, the more that I engage the brush, the more that I make a brush stroke and lift my pen and make another brush stroke, the more that it's going to, of course, add new pixels into that fine edge of the perimeter. But it's also going to make them very pixelated, very just a very rough edge, and I don't want to go too far with this. But if I paint white onto this mask, it's going to start revealing the original image of Black Panther, and that's what I want to do. But in overlay mode, as you'll notice here when I make a stroke, half of my brush is outside of the selection. So if the brushes mode was in normal, it would bring in the background itself. But since we're in overlay and I make one stroke like this, it fills in everything without going too far and doesn't bring the background into play. Now I'm making my brush smaller. And why? Because the more, again, that I add to this outer perimeter, the more pixelated it becomes. So in this case, if I make my brush a little bit smaller and I can stay inside the selection, I can see just a few pixels of blue that's coming through, and I can then refine that edge just a little bit more. So I'm going to go through it like this, all the way along the perimeter, keeping my brush small and trying to keep my brush inside of the selection and not outside, because the more that I go outside, the more that I'm potentially introducing artifacts and pixelated edges of the original background. I just rotated my screen, by the way, by hitting the letter R, which will take any tool and switch it to allow you to rotate your screen to get the right kind of orientation. And then when you let go of the letter R, it should default back to your tool. If it doesn't, just go ahead and hit the hotkey for the tool itself. And I did that because I paint better and I have better control with the pen when I paint left to right and not painting up and down. I'm going to rotate the screen a little bit more and just clean up this edge. And again, because I'm in overlay mode, I don't have to worry too much about going outside that selection perimeter. I don't want to go outside of it, but if I bump up against it or accidentally go over, then I'm okay. I'm not going to have to worry too much. And again, as you can see, it's building up that highlight, but there's just a couple little squares of pixels that are still blue, and that's because we're in overlay mode, and I can't do anything else. I've tapped it several times, and I can't do anything else to bring that back in. So I would have to switch my brush's blending mode back to normal to be able to get those pixels to come into play. I'm going to zoom in quite a bit just so you can see these two pixels right here are still blue, which means that we're seeing through the selection. And because I'm hitting painting on it, but my blending mode is overlay, it's not going to bring it in no matter what I do. So I need to switch the brush's blending mode back to normal. And the hotkeys to do that while the brush is active is to hit Alt Option, Shift, and N. And the letter N for normal will take it back to a blending mode of normal. Now I can paint it in one stroke and then take my brush's blending mode back to overlay by hitting Alt Option, Shift, and the letter O for overlay. And now we can continue to go along the entire perimeter of the image, but let's zoom out because there's no reason ever to zoom in that much to where you can see the individual pixels, unless you're making a video demonstrating brush tools. So I'm going to continue to go along the perimeter edge, and keep in mind for this selection and for this layer mask, my goal is to just eliminate some fringing. And I'm thinking about a time efficiency perspective. I want to eliminate some of this fringing, some of these artifacts along the edges, but I don't need to make a absolutely beautiful, perfect selection, because I know the output of the artwork that I'm going to do. And I also know that, well, I doubt Marvel Studios is going to call and say, oh my gosh, we saw your video, we love this piece, it's so beautiful, can you send us the Photoshop document, we'll buy it from you. I highly doubt that's going to happen, but anything is possible. But in this case, if I were to be working for a commercial entity, I would want to make sure that this layer mask is absolutely perfect, because that's part of the technique and artistry that they pay for when people and companies will hire you. While I'm in overlay mode, I have now flipped my foreground color to black, which means it's going to take away from this selection. And I now am keeping my brush on the outside perimeter of our selection, because there's just a little bit of fringing because we use that smart radius, and I'm just now cleaning that up and shoring up the edge just a little bit more. But the more that I engage this tool this way, the more that it can potentially cause pixelation, and I don't want to run that risk. So I'm just looking for any areas that I see some fringing that just needs to be shored up. And this is why I have bound the button on my Wacom pen to the letter X, because I can just sit here and flip back and forth, so I can paint inside the selection when I see something that's missing, and then easily switch my foreground color by hitting that button and going back and forth, and then switch to black to clean up some edges, and then white on inside, black on the outside. And I can just go along the entire perimeter this way, cleaning it up and making it look pretty decent. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that little fringe right there, because it's just not really necessary. Okay, and again, from a perspective of integrity for their costume, I don't want to make too many decisions about removing things along the edge that may not need to be there, like some of those little ripples, unless it's a costume like this where, I mean, you can use common sense. Like, is Converse Ninja gonna look at this picture and be like, dude, on my sleeve there's always a little fold of fabric and you cut off that little edge of fabric, what kind of artist are you? No, he's not going to care at all about those kinds of things. But the more that you alter and change somebody's costume, the more that you can potentially introduce some issues that they may not like. They may not like you just kind of arbitrarily deciding how their costume should look. I just switched my blending mode back to normal because I wanted to be able to get that little piece right there of the fin, and I'm, while in normal mode, just showing it up a little bit so we don't see any of that gray. And now I'm going to go ahead and go back to overlay mode by hitting Alt Option Shift and the letter O, which took me back to overlay. Painting with white through here and cleaning all this up. And again, I'm cleaning up an interior selection. Let's go ahead and take a view of the layer mask itself so you can see a little bit more of what we're doing. All of this rough edge, and to, by the way, to go into the view of the layer mask, I just hit Alt or Option and then click the layer mask itself. As you can see, I'm shoring up on the inside to make these areas that are through here, they're so rough, and it's just a little bit of fringing that I want to clean up to make a better selection. And with the overlay mode engaged for the brush, I can just come right to the edge, and I'm not worried that I'm going to go outside that line. It is going to build up along the perimeter, so I want to try to keep my brush inside the selection so I can shore these elements up. Also, while I'm in this view, this is a good way that in case any of those little selection pieces that were inside that were missing, you would see that very quickly, because all of a sudden it would just be a black section like that inside, and it would jump out at you immediately when you're in this view of the layer mask itself. So it's always a good idea to go into this view with the layer mask just to make sure that there isn't any sections that were missing from the overall selection that could cause problems. Okay, and I think we look pretty good. We've went along the entire perimeter. I can switch to black and just clean up some of those edges just a little bit. But I also know that as I am going to infuse the different pieces of stock, this part of his body down here from pretty much his belly button down, that part's going to fade out a little bit potentially. So I'm not too worried about making sure that's completely accurate in the selection itself. So I've been rotating my screen at different points to take my screen back to a normal orientation. I just hit the escape key and it'll bounce it right back. And wow, he looks like Batman from this. He just needs a big cape. Anyway, so then to go back to the normal view from the layer mask, I'm just going to hold Alt or Option and click the layer mask again, and it will take me back. So this is a pretty good selection because this was an easy character to take out and to clean up this layer mask. Again, if we could see his face and his hair, it would be a different story because we'd have to make selections around the hair, and then we'd have to paint in some fake hair and so forth to make it a little bit more believable. But in this case, with this kind of composite, it's going to be very easy because he's in a complete suit and his face is covered. So at this point, I think the quick selection process, we made that accurate selection. Well, Skynet made the accurate selection. We just helped Skynet out just a little bit. Skynet's using like DOS version 4, and we gave it like a little upgrade to like 4.2, right? And then we went in using the brush on the layer mask, using the blending mode of overlay to be able to shore up those edges just a little bit so that we have a really good representation of the character by making a great selection and no issues. So that's the end of this part of the video. And now we're going to step into the fun part, which is creating the world of the ancestral plane and bringing this art to life. So go ahead and step into the next Photoshop video.